Excellent. And I'm Amy Rado Parks. I'm also with Writing and Public Speaking Center. And I always joke, and this is I guess it's a kind of extra, maybe it's a funnier joke in this context, but my initial relationship with clarity and concision that's come through like an undergraduate and graduate degree in poetry, where the continuous debate is, have you said too many words or can you say fewer words? And so once I started really working on writing in different genres and professional and workplace writing, it took on a different tenor of thinking about like, can I say this in fewer words and still say enough? And it's true, there is a practice and some ways to think about doing that actually make it all of it a little bit easier on us as writers. So if you were here on Tuesday, then this will also be familiar to you. This is a slide we're going to use for all 4 of our talks because it's a foundational set of ideas about writing that is useful to have in mind. It's easy to have a nice to just make a little sketch of this yourself if it is, if that is interesting to you, because it can be helpful to have on hand when you are in a moment where you're just a little bit stuck. Sometimes we get stuck or overwhelmed with different kinds of workplace writing. And often if we have some sort of like something to map it onto, it can help us see that it's just a set of parameters that we're working within. So in every writing situation, in every instance when you're using writing, whether it is to text someone informally about hanging out later, or asking someone to stop to get bread, or sending an email at work, or, making a post on social media. In all of those situations, one of the things that unites them is that they're all operating in what we call a rhetorical situation, meaning it's involved with someone else. So there's always you being the writer, there's always a topic that it's about, and there's always an audience, there's always a reader. So those are the 3 main things that distinguish a writing scenario. So as soon as the topic changes, you're going to be writing about something else. But even if you're writing about the same topic to a different audience, a lot of times everything you say is going to change. So if we then add in this idea, the big center triangle of your purpose or your intention, also really informs why are you sitting down to write it? What's the goal behind it? What is the impetus? Like, what's your moment right then for opening it? Are you trying to communicate something? Are you just sharing information? Do you need something from someone? Did you think something's funny? So are you just sharing something funny in order to sort of bond with the person? So there are all kinds of reasons we decide to start typing, or that we need to start typing, whether it's with our thumbs or with our fingers. Oops. All right. So this is our sort of setup. The context in this case is workplace writing. The genre, the last thing to point out, little dotted lines, genres are different styles of writing. How an email, it might be different than a report, might be different than a memo, might be different than a post you put on Slack, right? So there are different ways that we communicate. The genre is the different medium or the different name of the thing you're writing. Right.
So this slide basically reiterates that rhetorical triangle, but more text. So when we talk about clarity, it's, are we being clear about a topic for a particular audience? So different audiences will need different levels of detail or explanation. And of course, we have to consider the purpose. We want to organize it well so that our reader can process the information quickly. And we want to do that in as few words as possible. These days, when so many people are reading a lot of things on smaller and smaller screens, so maybe on a tablet versus a big computer screen or even a phone, that makes our word count all the more important. Do people have to keep scrolling down the screen to get further? So all of this is motivation for us to be concise and use as few words as possible. So one litmus test, I think, for clarity is, can people read it quickly and understand the gist of it? If they can't, then there's probably something wrong with how it's written. It's either too wordy or it's not concise. So keep in mind, no matter who your audience is in this context of work, we tend to read things quickly. We're not savoring each word, right? We want to get to the point, get in, get out of a particular piece of communication, written communication.
Yes, but as you might already be guessing, there's attention built in there. How do I try to limit my words and also be clear? How do I know which direction I'm pulling? So these two things, it's similar. If you, most of us may have a memory of this at some point in our schooling of having a teacher say that. Can you simplify this? And also, can you add detail? This is a very common set of directions that we hear about writing. Like, I need more information. Also, can you make it shorter? Like really competing like tensions about what to do with writing. So what we're going to talk about are we're going to give you some ways to think about how to make those choices, because just saying, hey, make it shorter and be clear is not helpful. Those are the goals. That's where we're trying to end up. But in order to get there, it sometimes requires us to insert a couple other layers of thinking in the intermediary. And often this doesn't take it only takes a couple tries of thinking through a couple sets of questions in order to just get used to thinking about it differently. So what we're going to show you in the next slide, it looks like a big list of questions. But I'm going to explain how this box here, how it can give you some information about how to decide which pieces of information to use when. All right, so as we talked about a little bit, if you were at our last talk on Tuesday about audience and thinking about who it is, audience really drives so much of what we're doing as writers in every circumstance, because the goal of written communication is to communicate with that person. We can do self-expression on our own, right? But we are expressing to someone else. So it's only complete when the other person understands. And we know this, we also are readers too, right? We want to be able to also read things. So when we take these elements of our rhetorical triangle, we still have our writer, we still have our subject, we still have our audience. We have this framework, and I was kind of joking beforehand. I was like, it's sort of funny to leave this language the way it is in a talk about clarity and concision, because it's really has some funny wording. And it's because it's a translation of essentially what was like an ancient Greek way of talking about audience and subject and writer. So this is coming from like ancient rhetoric. And so this book that it comes out of, so I've gotten so used to reading it that it was only right before this that I was like, oh, it sounds really funky and clunky to present about clarity and concision. However, we'll put this out. So what it's asking you to think about is very carefully what's the relationship here. So if we look at this, and remember the goal of this is to decide where we're headed after this is we're thinking about what the relationship is in order to make some choices about how we're going to do the writing. So first question, the writer. So do I have immediate support from the audience? Meaning, does the audience already agree with what I'm going to say? Are they going to be fine with it? Or am I going to have to haggle for agreement? Like, is my main thing already that I'm in a thing with the audience? If that is the initial thing, the subject is sort of secondary. If that's the initial thing, then in some way I need to address the audience directly, right? So let's say I need to ask someone a favor, but I haven't actually talked to them in 6 months. And the last time we talked or emailed, there was a beef, right? There was a thing that just went by the wayside, but has never been addressed. And now I have to write them about a thing. So there's a moment there where actually the audience is more important than the subject at the beginning. It's useful, and so writing is social. Even when we're writing, it remains a social scenario. So in that case, it is useful to have an initial statement or comment saying, I haven't talked to you in a while. How are you? You don't need to say, hey, when we talked last, it was really uncomfortable. But you can acknowledge that you haven't talked in a while. So this is that first question. What is the relationship between you and the audience? The second is the audience is unsympathetic to you or the subject. So that means like they're not super interested in what you have to say. They're not super interested in the subject. Like, are they interested in you or are they interested in the subject? So you may think about this as, I always joke about trying to persuade teenagers to care about something that they don't care about, such as how many gym bags can be on the kitchen table. For example, like this is not a thing that is particularly of interest to them, but it is to me. So they, have to be sympathetic to me, but they are not sympathetic to the topic in any way. So we attend to these things regularly in person, where we realize in that moment, then I need to show the audience why I actually want them to care about the subject first. I'm not going to just launch into explaining something or asking someone to do something if they don't really know what the topic is. So in that moment, I might think like, I guess maybe I need to tell them why this matters. And then I can tell them something else, or even define what the subject is, not assume that the person even understands what the thing is we're talking about. All right. So this is the audience regards the writer or the issue as unimportant or uninteresting. So this, you can see we're really starting to look at like, they're not sympathetic to it, or do they get it, but they don't find it interesting, hence the gym bag comment. Like, we get that you don't want the stuff on the table, but I don't care that much. That's a really different conversation than just trying to get someone to see that it's an issue. So showing someone then your job is to show why the subject is important or should be interesting to that person. That will give you a starting point. And the fourth one, it says the audience is unsure about what's at issue. Maybe they agree, maybe they don't. So really, if we look at this, the audience doesn't know what the issue is. So in that case, we need to start by explaining what the issue is before we jump straight into explaining what needs to be done about it or why we care about it. But we can just say the actual situation is there are multiple bags on the kitchen table, so we can't eat dinner. Also, the things are really dirty and disgusting. But also, finally, the last one is the subject is too difficult for the audience to understand, either because they don't have the information or just because the subject is complicated. So this is a really useful difference too. Like, does the audience know what you're talking about? Maybe they don't, but it's because it's hard. So if that's true and they don't have enough information or it's really complicated, beginning by acknowledging that it's complicated or providing information is a really useful way to start your correspondence. So what we're looking at here, and this is, so I remember to begin with, I said, this looks like it can be a complicated way. But in essence, what it does is it really narrows down our choices. If you are sitting with a difficult piece of workplace writing and you, like a lot of times what happens is we're like, get ready to do it and we're stuck. So there are a lot of reasons we can be stuck. And this is like a nice set of questions to tick through to be like, where actually am I stuck? And what it really shows you is usually where to begin. Where do I need to begin this in order to get to the thing that my audience needs most? Frankly, a lot of times with new folks that you haven't worked with before, it is often that they don't know you or the subject. Like, they don't know you, they just started. So it does make sense to introduce yourself and be a little bit friendly. You are then the subject of the email, and as well as the subject you were actually writing about. All right, so we're going to be integrating some of this as we go through.
So again, these things are complicated, and it can be useful to pause as we're writing to think about who our audience is, what it is they need to know next, and what is the main thing they need to understand from this piece of writing. Excuse me. And thinking about your audience's attitude toward you and the subject matter is so helpful in figuring out, as Amy said, where to begin. So this is just a list of questions on this slide of questions to help you figure out what to write where. So what level of detail do you need? How much history or context do you need to provide? And what vocabulary can you use? Is there a common terminology? Oftentimes in a workplace, we have a shorthand and people in our workplace understand those terms, but someone new may not. Or if you're turning away from your colleagues and addressing people outside your organization, then you may have to use a different set of terms or explain some of the terms that you're using. An example I think about is like trying to explain to my dad how to get voicemail on his smartphone. He doesn't know where to look on a phone. So, and using things like scroll up or scroll over or double tap, those are things that don't mean anything to him because he isn't fluent in working on a smartphone. So I have to give him a lot more detail in order for him to figure out what to do next. And I think, Amy, you had another example.
Yeah, we one of the other examples can kind of run the reverse side of that is understanding when and how we are sort of operating in a space where we are just assuming that other people have the same knowledge of a place or processes or policy or procedure, where we just forget that those are not things that everybody might know, and trying to make sure that we can, if we don't know whether or not someone knows it, then making sure we kind of allude to that sort of thing, or providing, I know that some of the assessment projects that I run, I'm working with folks that are parallel to the project, but they don't know the insides of the project. So when I actually am in correspondence, I can say, hey, remember, this is familiar, but for reference, in parentheses, here's a link where you can actually read more detail if you want. Sort of acknowledging at the front that maybe people don't know, and trying to find a quick way to acknowledge that they might not, and not necessarily call them out on it, but remind them that it exists and that they can also find it. One thing we used to do that was pretty interesting illustration in some of the classes that I used to teach with first year students on campus, I would ask them to write out directions from the classroom to home, however they defined home. And so their first audience was somebody else in the room, somebody else, somebody who knew the campus, and then maybe someone from home, someone who didn't know campus. So most students knew campus, but they didn't know where the person's home was, or their audience from home knew Idaho, but they didn't know campus. So as students would start to write it out, they would realize that they could refer to geographical markers that weren't official. Say if they were writing to a sibling, they'd be like, and then remember, you just turn at the street where we always trick-or-treated. They could make insider reference to various pieces of information, but not, as soon as they were writing to someone else, they were trying to just stay with observational things like the name of the street, the name, are you turning left or right? Is that north or south? And so just trying to observe how the language we use and the information we include or exclude. We are already doing that with audiences. We do a lot of this socially, and it's just as much becoming aware of how and when we're doing it conscientiously, when we're doing our workplace writing. Yes. So one of the main decisions is what to include and what to leave out. That sounds like a really simple thing to say, but it is, for me, it's at the core of all of my complications of trying to decide how to write something. What do I want to put in? What can I leave out? Or am I giving too much information? Most of us by default land in one camp or the other. We are either someone who can write 25 words and declare it complete, or we need to write 5 pages and declare it complete. Like, I'm being extreme, but like most of us either write a ton that we might not need, or we don't write enough and we think we're being clear, but there's a bunch more that other people need. So the reason we like the image of the pie is that if we go back to thinking about the topic, the subject, writer, and audience, if we think about the subject, first of all, if you're writing something and there is more than one subject, it's useful to just note that. If the issue, you have like, well, one subject is I need to ask someone for a report, but the other subject is they didn't write the last report on time and I need to bring that up. Also, it wasn't very good. That's a third is that a third subject or a second subject? Right. So starting to think about like, what all do I need to cover under this? So the pie represents everything that could possibly be said. everything you could say, but everything is not useful. And sometimes if this is a contentious piece of writing, we do just need to write a draft where we say everything we need to say. And then we go back and we're like, actually, the only useful part is this chunk. This person needs this information and needs these comments. So I can actually pull the rest of this out. And that, I think right now in our contemporary moment, this is particularly a poignant part of the question, because a lot of us, and really are trying to decide how much of ourselves we want to put in our communications. How much do we want to share about our experiences, our thoughts and ideas? What does it mean to do that in pieces of writing? Is it relevant or not? And these are questions that really can only be answered in the scenario of your piece of writing. You have different relationships with most of the people you write to, so the answer to that will be different. But thinking about that question, do I need to include all of this? I know for me, in my first drafts of everything, it always says, I feel, I think, I feel, I think. And then when I go back, I usually take out a lot of the feels and just say, this is just true. Like, I feel like I feel like this timeline is too far accelerated. And by the time I get to end of a draft, I think, no, the timeline is just too accelerated. Timeline needs to slow down. So how I rephrase things often is there's a difference between me needing to express a certain thing and me needing to actually communicate to someone else. What do they actually need to know? And in that way, leaving some space and time when you know you're writing a piece, giving yourself time to make more than one draft. It also sounds simplistic, but in terms of, it's very difficult for us to make choices about not only what to include and what to leave out, but it's also hard for us to see what we have included and what we have left out until we have a little bit, even a couple hours, sometimes even just a couple of hours on a draft from morning until afternoon before you click send can help you just see if you've given the right information. Yeah, go ahead, Trine.
And I just wanted to jump in and talk about drafting, that it's so important for workplace communications to allow yourself time to have multiple drafts. And a colleague of mine always said that the first draft was for herself to figure out all that she wanted to say and needed to say. And then the next draft was for her audience. So we're talking about being concise and being really clear, but that often doesn't happen in the first draft. And we want to just remind you all that that's really normal. And it's hard sometimes to think simultaneously about our audience and about the topic. Sometimes we have to, like, let's just say everything we know about the topic and that we need people to know. And then the next draft, we can think more about what our audience needs to know about the topic. So leave yourself space for those and don't expect that you can hold all of those ideas and those tensions in your head at the same time, and with a single drafting process. So when we're doing that second draft with our audience in mind, we need to think about what it is our reader needs from us right now. And to remember that in American workplace writing, really the responsibility is on the writer to make it really clear so the reader doesn't have to work very hard. That means the writer has to do more of the hard work so that the reader doesn't have to interpret or infer. So it's useful to think about what our readers expect. And we are trained to expect this from the types of workplace communications that we're exposed to. So readers expect characters and actions, and they expect the verbs to be close to the subject. So both of those are about who's doing what. They want that to be really clear, who's doing what. Readers also expect old information to be at the beginning of a sentence, and that for that old information to lead to the new information that's going to come at the end of the sentence. And Also, if with different genres, we expect information to be in particular places. So knowing the genre of a piece of writing and knowing where to put that information will really help your reader be able to skim and be able to get the information quickly and without having to read more than once to understand what it is you want to say.
Yeah, and we're going to talk a little bit more of those bullet points that say old information and new information. We're going to loop back to some of that in a later slide too, to give you some illustration of what that means.
Yeah, so here's an example of who's doing what. Oh, that was a lovely echo. Okay, so who's doing what? So here's kind of a before and after, or a longer version and a shorter version. So the first version, the behavioral manifestations of stress responses have been shown to vary greatly between individuals in rodents, pigs, birds, fish, and humans. Not bad, but compare that with this much shorter version. Individual rodents, pigs, birds, fish, and humans behave very differently in response to stress. So notice we have a strong verb, and we have this in the second section, and we have the subject, individual rodents, birds, pigs, birds, fish, and humans. That's the kind of a long subject, and it's immediately next to the verb behave. And then we have how they behave. Whereas in the first example, the behavioral manifestations of stress responses, so that's the subject. So that's already hard to understand. What are behavioral manifestations of stress responses? And then have been shown, passive voice, to vary greatly between, and then we have this list of animals. So it's just a little bit convoluted and harder to parse. It does make sense if we slow down and read it carefully, but we can get the same information much more quickly from the second version. And as Amy noted in the chat, if you have questions or comments as we continue through, please feel free to write those in the chat.
Sweet. Yes, and we will actually have a moment. Are gonna work through a couple more slides, but we actually have a couple of pieces of text. We'll ask you if you want to simplify some different ways. We'll ask you to work in the chat, but we have a little bit more. So we have a couple slides that are of words. And so these, as we work through these, so this one is particular about verbs. So if you probably haven't thought about your parts of a sentence in a while, a verb is the action word. I mean, I remember learning that as a little kid. It's the action. It's the doing and being. So these are the words that are making things happen in a sentence. However, a lot of times what can happen is that we end up using these abstract nouns instead of just using the verb. That gives a sentence. A verb is what drives a sentence forward. It communicates to someone what needs to be done, what is already happening, the state of things. So it's a much more concrete way of writing. This change alone can help add clarity and concision to what you're presenting in your writing. You just notice, I mean, it is like, instead of saying there is an understanding, I could say I understand, or we understand. It just automatically makes it much more clear. So as you're looking at these, you might note, like, are there, and we have some phrases we're going to come up, we have in some of the next slides too. Are there things you notice about your own writing? Are there certain words in here that you find yourself using, or does this sound accurate? Do you notice yourself using abstract nouns, or can you think of, or do you feel like you land in verbs? This is just for you to think about as we're looking through these. Also to say, sometimes we make these moves in writing where we default to things like these abstract nouns, sometimes because we are unsure of ourselves as writers. It's kind of an uncomfortable moment to be writing something when you aren't sure about how well you're going to write about it or how much you know. And we're unsure about how it's supposed to sound. Right there, we're not really sure what is going to sound smart enough or clear enough. I mean, it sounds really simple to say, but it's the most common anxiety is that we're not going to sound smart when we're writing something. So sometimes we end up defaulting to some of these abstract nouns because they sound elevated, but they don't communicate as well. And so mostly what we're aiming for is just clarity, because clarity comes through simple language, and simple language itself is difficult. It's difficult enough to communicate thoughts in words. Just going for like, are the things I think presented in the words? That is very hard anyway. So the clearer we can remove ourselves from having to use abstract nouns, even if it's just in your first draft, it's really nice to just sit back and try to just use some of the verbs.
And more about verbs. So strong verbs are not to be or to have. And what's confusing in English is that the verbs to be and to have are also auxiliary verbs. They also mark tense and mood of a verb, so which is different from them being the main verb. So I am tired, I'm using the verb to be to explain my state, and my state is being tired. But the verb to be is different there than I am going to the store. I am going. That's future tense. So the am is part of the verb tense. It's not the whole verb. And similarly, have can be an auxiliary verb. So so I have been to Glacier Park, or I have visited Glacier Park. The have again is part of the verb visited, and telling you, giving you information about when I visited Glacier Park, as opposed to we have an understanding. So there's that abstract noun understanding, and instead of we understand or we agree. So have there is more of a heavy, let me rephrase that. To be and to have are useful verbs, but if they are the main verb, they don't carry the writing forward. They tend to stop the action. So they should be used sparingly. So here is an example. The first, again, the longer version, and then the shorter version. Understanding season habitat ranges and their distribution is critical for the greater prairie chicken conservation and management. So what's the verb? The verb is the main verb of that long sentence. It's is critical. So again, we have a long subject, understanding season habitat ranges and their distribution is the subject. The verb is and is critical. Pretty long. I think we have to read that slowly and maybe twice to understand the meaning. Compared to the second one, before we can conserve and manage greater prairie chickens, we must understand their seasonal habitats. You can see it's just much easier to get the information out of the second one. Fewer words, the subject is closer to the verb, and the verb is stronger.
Awesome. Here's another example. And you can see where we're offering examples where we are necessarily going from a lot of writing down to a small amount of writing, and sometimes the opposite will end up happening. But in this case, we have, if any member of the board retires, this is sample language, right? The company, at the discretion of the board, and after notice from the chairman of the board to all members of the board, at least 30 days before executing this option, may buy, and the retiring members must sell the members' interest in the company. I would love to say I never read sentences like this. but I do. And so we can basically, this says the company may buy a retiring member's interest, right? The first was written by, you are right. I bet it was. But also what's interesting to me about the first one is I feel like they were like, all right, our problem is what to do if the board retires. Okay, in that case, the company can do blank. But wait, no, it has to be at the discretion of the board. So like, it's almost like you can see the thinking just kept getting added in various phrases. So it, to me, always often reads like a first draft. And then we're like, oh, but we did just arrive at, and it's true. There are some specifications about like the days that could just go in a different sentence. But at the core of what the subject is, this is a fair, much more concise version of it. All right. Similarly, something that we haven't really brought up yet, but I think is also really useful to think about with workplace communications is, well, first of all, so we're going to talk about this text, but also thinking about the way the text is organized visually. So here, I don't know, so I'm going to give it a shot and see if I can even read this out loud. We must receive your completed application form on or before the 15th day of the second month following the month you are reporting if you do not submit your application electronically, or the 25th day of the second month following the month you are reporting if you submit your application electronically.
First of all, simplify your system.
It does feel like it's the DMV, right? It would be like, wait, I'm not supposed to figure that. Whenever I see language like this, I was like, they don't want me to understand. I'm going to decode it and figure it out. But some of it has to do with, like, do we need this information to arrive in a paragraph, or can it arrive? Can we visually arrange it a little bit differently? We do live in a time. Yeah, your sentence needs a spreadsheet. That is true. Might be a sign. That is a great point. But we live in a time where we use visual arrangement of language all the time. So bulleted lists, or this sort of like, if you submit your form by email, we need to receive it by this time, mail or fax, so this is like, when is it useful to say things in a paragraph, or when am I going to actually speak to my audience better? By having a colon and then a list. Like, is this a thing? And that, I think this is really a different sort, it could be a whole different conversation, but just to put in there, like, sometimes because we are sending or receiving things in paragraphs doesn't always mean it has to be the default. Especially if the ultimate goal is to be able to communicate clearly.
Yes, and if you have to decode it by putting it into a chart, perhaps your reader would appreciate that as well, because this is a complicated procedure. So yeah, if it helps you to understand it, it will likely help your audience to understand it. If it is put in a table or represented more visually.
All right. So we just have, this is yet another, I think we have this and one more slide of just words, of common workplace words that we can just make shorter. I think endeavor in the third column over is one of those that I hear often. And I like, it is really just, it can be try, unless we're really trying to elevate and say we should endeavor to, there's like an elevation to it, maybe that we are trying, maybe there's like an inspirational element to it. But for the most part, if we are just trying to collect ideas about how to make something happen, or just share information about something, a lot of times, especially if you are unfamiliar with your audience, if you are unfamiliar with how well, and one of the things we talked about on Tuesday was understanding that we have many varying levels of writing abilities and writing levels of confidence, but the same goes for reading. So we all bring really different backgrounds and experiences with reading, different histories of it from school, different capacities for just what kinds of things we are able to read and understand. And if you don't know, if you haven't had correspondence with an audience, then you really want the primary goal to be the communication of the topic, not necessarily something about your own authority. Sometimes is how this comes through. Like, opting for the short language is the safer bet. There are other ways to demonstrate authority or credibility about a topic, if that's something you need to do. But if you really need someone to understand instructions or directions or information, it's much safer to default to the simpler version of a word.
This discussion just reminds me of when I watch the Olympics, diving, for example, those people can do such amazing things and it looks so easy.
Yeah.
And sometimes the most beautiful things are the simplest, just a swan dive, and it looks so simple and so easy. And I think the same is true about really clear explanations in workplace writing. It looks like it's a really easy thing to do because it's so easy to understand. That doesn't mean it was easy to write. But again, it is the writer's responsibility to do the heavy lifting so that the reader has access to the information very quickly.
All right, last one. Some of these may also look familiar. Just give you a second to read. Looking at where we can thin language, there are some common phrasings that, and you may be able to, once this is on your mind, even if you comb back through some communications you have written recently, it could be useful after this to look back and try to objectively ask yourself, like, am I using some of these phrases or these word choices? Are there places where I can, like, what are my own habits? So part of this is we get used to writing in a certain way. All of us just, we just we build habits. And so just observing, like, what is your habit? Do you already use the shorter substitutes, or are you comfortable with some of the longer versions of these things? And there's nothing wrong. I mean, we have this as wordy. It's true maybe in this circumstance, but there are other rhetorical situations in which this kind of writing is so if you were writing a graduate thesis, this is the sort of language that your advisors would be looking for. There's like the opposite side of being too simple and too concise in grad theory, for better or for worse. I always struggled with that. I was like, let's make it concise. But there are circumstances in which this works well. With writing, the question is always, do my choices serve my goals right now? What's my intention and my purpose? And do my actual words, like at the actual word level, are they serving that purpose? Or can I just change them a little bit so that I am just more confident that my purpose is being met of communicating or informing in particular?
So these lists that we've given you, and then just the whole notion about strong verbs, these are questions that you can use to revise your writing. Just go through and look. Do I have a lot of abstract nouns? Can I make some of them verbs? Do I have a lot of to be and to have? Can I make those verbs stronger? Do I have these longer, wordier phrases too much? Are there some of those that I can trim? So these are things that you can use to revise your writing to make it more concise. Amy, we will certainly get the slides to you.
Yeah, and then we're gonna change gears. We have a couple of examples to show you all too. This is where we're gonna loop back to that old information and new information from an earlier slide.
Yes, so this is called the known new contract. And when I first learned this, I was like, oh, I've been working on this so much and helping student writers with this, but I didn't know what to call it. So I'm sure a lot of you do this intuitively. You look for it as readers and you do it as writers, but you may not have seen it explained this way. So hopefully this explanation will help you in revising your writing. So readers expect, okay, reader, I want to bring you in and connect you to me and to something you know about. And then I'm going to introduce the new thing. And then in my next sentence, I'm going to refer back to the new thing I just talked about. So now it's not new anymore, now it's known. And then I'm going to give you more new information. So this is a way that we make a writing cohere. We make one sentence connect to the next sentence by referring back to the previous sentence. by referring back to the information that's at the end of the last sentence. So think of this as like a spiral or like a chain. This is how we connect the dots. And let's look at an example to help you see this. And we're using a lot of scientific writing for our examples today, because scientific writing is often hard to understand. I mean, the concepts are hard, the terminology is hard, and we often pick on scientific writing as being examples of wordy and not great writing. So I'm going to read both of these out loud to you, and I just want to get tell me how you understand them, I guess is what I'm asking. Is one easier to understand than another? Okay, some astonishing questions about the nature of the universe have been raised by scientists exploring the nature of black holes in space. The collapse of a dead star into a very small point creates a black hole. So much matter compressed into so little volume changes the fabric of space around it in profoundly puzzling ways. Okay, so I'm just going to point out that we have questions about the nature of the universe. That's that's at the beginning of the first sentence. And if that's the known new contract, then that's the known. And then the new is black holes in space, exploring the nature of black holes in space. Then the next sentence, the collapse of a dead star into a very small point creates a black hole. So now we have the term black hole at the end of the second sentence, as well as at the end of the first sentence. And I'm already thinking, I want that black hole to be referred to at the beginning of that sentence so I understand. Then that last sentence, so much matter compressed into so little volume. Okay, that's kind of rephrasing part of what's in the previous sentence, the collapse into a very small point. Okay, so there is a connection there. It changes the fabric of space around it in profoundly puzzling ways. Okay, so now we have puzzling ways, which I think is connecting back to questions in that first sentence. Okay, let's look at the next one. Some astonishing questions about the nature of the universe have been raised by scientists exploring the nature of black holes in space. A black hole is created when a dead star collapses into a very small point. So much matter compressed into so little volume changes the fabric of space around it in profoundly puzzling ways. All right. What do you think about that second version? Feel free to chime in the chat. You can see that the italicized words are pointing to the known and the new.
I appreciate about this one too, that it's nice to see that we can go from a very small point to compressed to so little volume. So it doesn't have to be the exact same words, but to begin with the same concept or a really echoed phrase to make that bridge across. This is an interesting one to look at, which we'll probably also pick up again and develop more in our next one on reports and looking at how we are explaining complicated concepts. Because it gives us a framework in just how to write about those things too, when we're trying to figure out how to structure them. Let's see. All right, so we have just this last slide, and then finally, I'm just looking at the chat too. It is a lot easier to understand. Yeah, even when we know nothing about black holes, or I speak for myself, who knows nothing about black holes. All right, so we have 5-6 minutes left. So take a look at these two, and maybe take a stab, pick one or do both.
Sorry about that.
It's okay. How you would make it more concise, and post those up in the chat. You can pick one or do both. First one says, we hereby wish to let you know that our company is pleased with the confidence you have reposed in us. At this time, I'm writing to you to enclose an interview card, which has been postpaid for the purpose of arranging a convenient time when we might get together for a personal interview. Yeah, and this, we could even, the second one, even get in 2 sentences, right? Writing to see when we might be able to get together. I've enclosed my contacts or something, right? I've enclosed an interview card. Just been postpaid. What is an interview card? Now that I'm looking at it, I'm like, I don't even know what that is.
I think it's pre-electronic stuff is when you
Right? I'm like,
you needed to mail something back saying when you would come and selecting a time for an interview.
now I'm like, where's the LinkedIn version of that, right? It's true though. We're like, what does it mean? I'm not even sure. But we can see that there's phrase after phrase. So another cue you might notice is like, and we're not really just talking about punctuation here, but in this case, in the first instance, it's just that this word doesn't make a lot, there's just extra words. Hereby doesn't, just the word hereby in general, we don't really probably need to use in workplace correspondence. Unless it's in your bylaws of some organization somewhere, which even then it seems dated. But this one, just see how many there's like a comma, you know, there's like parenthetical parent. It's like there's just phrase after phrase after phrase. So sometimes if you're noticing that too, it might be also just a visual clue that like, is there too much packed into this sentence, and can I put it into 2 sentences in order to make sure that my verbs are in place.
I like Marilyn's revision. A postpaid interview card is enclosed. Please return it to schedule a personal interview. Great. That's much clearer.
Yeah, the verb's super clear. It actually just what we need to do. Please return it. The beginning of the sentence. Yes, I think sometimes, oh, thank you. I know we're almost done too, because we have them as well. The last, if we want to skip that next one, maybe.
Yeah, I think we do want to skip. We'll just go on.
So the last thing is to know that one of the things we know from research is that the more complicated the situation. So if the topic is complicated or the relationship between the subject and audience is complicated, the more the complexity rises, our ability to be clear and concise decreases. It's harder. So the higher the stakes, the more like the decrease in the writing capacity. And that usually is a cue that you just need to be patient, to leave time to draft, even have somebody else read over, just take a glance at it to see, even for things like tone. Somebody doesn't need to know what the topic is to get a sense of what the tone is. Does this sound friendly? Does it sound instructive? What does it sound like? Grammarly will give you suggestions at this point. I'm always surprised by Grammarly's observations of my tone. Sometimes want to haggle with Grammarly a little bit for that, but it's just useful to know, because sometimes we get really bungled up writing things, and it isn't because we suddenly aren't good at writing. A lot of times it's because there's something we haven't identified yet that is sort of in between us and writing the thing. There's something happening that we haven't like put a name to. And often once we can name it, with that rhetorical triangle especially, we can navigate it. Once we can see, it gives us a little map and we can sort of navigate from there.
Great. Thank you so much for having us. I know that Maisa wants to do a closing poll.
Yes, thank you, Amy and Shireen. So an evaluation will be emailed out to everyone. If you're able to fill this out, it will help our trainers for future trainings. And again, thank you for joining us and attending today's training on clear and concise writing. We won't be having an ending poll for today's training.
Okay.